So we're getting ready to talk about the software platform that's used to operate the Thermogenesis 10S UV Vis detector. So this is probably the simplest software platform that we have in our laboratory. And on these computers that operate this piece of equipment, it's all software driven, and the name of the software is going to be Vision Light. And you will see that name on the desktop to each one of these computers when you come into the laboratory. So right here is the icon for the Vision Light software. Now this desktop is my personal desktop that I have downloaded onto the computer in the instrumentation room. So when you log on, or depending on who logs on, the desktop could look a little different. It could have a few icons that are different on the screen, but you will see at least the Vision Light software with every login, username, and password that's entered in. So to start the software up, it's just like anything else. You hover over the icon and you double click that icon. And then this box will pop up, and there's a couple of options: scan, rate, fixed, quant, and PV test. So I want to talk about a few of these, but not all of them. The scan function is for you to scan the sample in a window of wavelengths. So for instance, if the lab directions tell me to scan between 200 to 300 nanometers, then that is the option that I want to go into, because it's going to allow me to make measurements across a wide scale of wavelengths. Rate we will not work with, so I won't even mention about that. That's really dealing with kinetic theory when it comes to chemistry. Our third one is called fixed. Now when fixed is concerned, that means that I know what one particular wavelength to dial into and to measure at. So for instance, I would use the scan to scan an entire region of numbers to pick out my lambda max. Once I know what my lambda max is, then I can go into the fixed part of the software, type in that wavelength, and do my measurements based on that one particular wavelength. And that's really what we do in our laboratory. That's what you'll be doing in your practice laboratory, and that's also what you'll be doing in the competition part of the Chemtechathon if you're involved in that. The next one is Quant. Quant is quantitative, so this allows me to do measurements and concentrations and calculations automatically. The machine will do it for me, but I'm not going to teach you how to go that route, because we think it's very important for you to know how to do a spreadsheet and how to do your own calibration curve and not rely on the instrument. And then finally, PV test. This is something that we don't really have to talk about either. We can leave it off and only focus on the scan and the fixed. So I'm going to pretend like I don't know what this sample is. I don't know what wavelength to run, and I'm going to go into the scan feature first in order for me to figure out what that number is that we should be measuring at. So I'll click scan, and then I'm going to come over and I'll hit OK. This triggers the software and the instrument to connect to each other. You will probably hear some gears turn on the instrument. You'll see a slight delay for the software to connect to the instrument, and this is our software screen. So this is the home screen. This is what will show up every time I begin the software. And up here in the top corner, you don't see very many options for you to choose from, and that's good. Remember, I told you this is probably one of the most simplest pieces of software that we have in our lab. So the method here up underneath, don't really pay attention to this. It's going to pop up some kind of weird random name, and that's okay. We always make changes depending on what we're running, and we don't really necessarily go by methods here. So just ignore that. Just pretend like that's not even there. This will allow me to set certain parameters and save them, so that way if I'm too lazy to go in and type in the start and the end number for the wavelength, I can just go and pull up the method that was previously done and allow those method parameters to be automatically loaded for me. Well, it takes longer to open up a saved method than it does for me to actually type in the numbers that I need to run. So that's why I'm telling you forget about the method. Who cares about it? Underneath the scan, I see the start and the end values. So this will give me the window, the minimum and the maximum according to the window. If I'm measuring an organic compound, I will probably go from 200 to 400 here. If I'm measuring maybe something colored, then I'll go from 400 to 800 here. And we will tell you at least the scanning window that you should be scanning at. We're not going to rely on you to make that judgment. So we'll at least give you the window so you know what numbers to start at. The interval, right now it's set at 1 nanometer, which means that it has the distinguishment between 254, 255, 256. I can change that sensitivity though. I can go down to 0.5, 0.2, or 0.1. So for instance, if I choose the 0.5 here, this will be 254, 254.5, 255, 255.5, 256. You get the drift. And then if I choose the 0.1, that's 254. And then, you guess it, 254.1, 254.2, 254.3, 254.4. So I've got control of really the sensitivity here as far as how far that wavelength needs to go. By default, it's set at 1 nanometer. We're okay with that. If we're doing something special, we'll need to change that setting. But for what we're going to be doing as far as the basics and as far as the laboratory training, 1 nanometer, perfectly okay. The measurement mode here is default for A, that stands for absorbance. If I click the drop down box, I'll see a couple of different units that I can choose from. Well, everything that we do is in absorbance, right? We talked about why absorbance is used and not transmittance. So I want to make sure that it does say A, and if so, we're good to go. The scan speed. Right now they give me 3 options: slow, medium, and fast. This is how fast you want the instrument to make the measurements, right? If you're just doing kind of an overall general picture, then by all means do the fast method. Don't allow the machine to overwork itself. If you really want to zone in on one area though, you might want to choose slow. So the instrument will take its time and really do pretty good measurements for you with every single wavelength that you have to do. By default, it's set at medium, and I'm also going to tell you to leave it at medium for most of what you do. If this setting has to be changed, we will tell you and we will let you know. The Advanced Parameters button, if I click that box, this will come up and it will say Spectrophotometer, and it says Reflectance Correction. Well, there's nothing there that you need to do, so cancel out of that screen. If you accidentally press it, it's okay. You can't really do anything there anyway. The graph, y-axis maximum, y-axis minimum. Right now it's set by default 0 to 1. These absorbance values should not be over 1 absorbance. If they are, then we don't really trust the machine the higher that number goes. So by default setting, it's a 0 and a 1. After the sample scans, and if we have to make that change, we can do that later, or we can just simply rescan it with a bigger window. Maybe we would go from 0 to 2 absorbance instead of from 1 absorbance. It just takes a couple of seconds to do the scan anyway, so most of the time that's what happens when I do it. And then Pick Peak, probably the most important box here that you need to choose from. And this Pick Peak, you want to make sure that the maxima is checked. If the maxima is not checked, then it will not label any peaks for you at all. And that's bad news, because if it can't label a peak, it can't give you an absorbance. If you can't get an absorbance, then you can't get data to do your calibration curve and to do your sample preparation with. So you want to make sure that this is checked. If this is not checked, and you scan a sample, you will see it pop up on the screen, but you will see no data associated with it. And you can't go back and fix it, which means that you have to rerun that sample. And you have to make sure that this box is checked before you go further. Under the Advanced Options tab, if I click that one, it's going to ask me for a wait time. I don't know why you would use that, but it gives me the preference for it. And then it lets me say repetitive measurement, total runtime and interval time. So do I want to do repeat measurements, more than one, to do an average absorbance? I could set the machine to do that if I wanted it to. But again, for what we do, for the most part, we don't need to go into these advanced options or advanced settings. So this is the side screen that you will be looking at when you go in and do your first sample runs, and this is your first kind of interaction maybe with the software platform. So hopefully you won't get scared away from it. There's just a couple of buttons here, and then in the next video what we'll do is that I'll put a sample into the machine and I'll show you how to scan and how to start to analyze your data and what would be the next step from this point on. So stay tuned, more to come.